African Studies at Stanford's online Africa Table seminar. My name is Joelle Cabrita. I'm the faculty director of the Center for African Studies here at Stanford, and I hold positions in the History Department and the Department for African and African American Studies at Stanford. The event that you've all joined us for is called Africa Table, and it is our regular lunchtime seminar. It's a very old seminar. It's been running for over 50 years, and it's our great pleasure to invite a range of scholars of the continent to share on their research and then open up for questions from the audience. So it's our very, very great pleasure today to welcome Professor who teaches politics at the University of Oxford in the UK. Professor Tendi is author of several books, including Army and Politics in Zimbabwe, Majuro, the Liberation Fighter and Kingmaker, as well as Making History, Politics, Intellectuals, and the Media. His latest book, which is the topic of his talk to us today, is called The Overthrow of Robert Mugabe, Gender, Coups, and Diplomats. And in it, Miles offers a rereading of the 2017 Zimbabwean coup. He argues in particular that in analyzing such coups in Zimbabwe and elsewhere, that scholars should pay closer attention than perhaps we usually do to the central role of gender as well as women's politics in coups. So in this way, his powerful book challenges conventional narratives of male-dominated coups and also shows how diplomatic responses intersect with complex internal dynamics. So Miles, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. The order of play for the audience is that Miles will speak on his book for around half an hour or so, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. I believe that you can put your questions in the chat to my colleague, Dr. Robin Chapdelaine, who will moderate the questions for Miles, and we will plan to wrap up on the hour, which, depending on your time zone, is 1 p.m. or something very different, depending on where you're in the world. So thank you, Miles, and over to you. Miles, you're muted.
Thank you for the generous introduction and for the invitation. I hope you can all see the presentation I'm sharing. Brilliant. Okay, so this is the title of the talk. Gender is the stuff of coups. What I mean by this is basically that coups are decidedly gendered operations with respect to their motivations, justifications, enactments, and aftermaths. That's what I'm trying to argue in the book. But before all this gendered stuff, let me do this first. We just had a coup in Madagascar. Literally yesterday, this was formalized. I look forward to having an engaging discussion with you about this particular coup in the Q&A. It won't be the subject of the talk, but I have a lot to say about it in relation to gender, women's politics, as well as other characteristics of that coup in Madagascar. But this coup in Madagascar coming in 2025 comes on the back of a resurgence of coups on the continent. 2021, we saw 4 successful coups in Sudan, Mali, Guinea, and Chad, 2 failed coups in 2021, and that 2021 uptick in coup occurrence is the highest in Africa in a single year for over two decades. So coups are back in many ways. In 2022, we saw 2 successful coups in Burkina Faso. In 2023, successful coups transpired in Nigeria and Gabon. Allowing successful coups in 2024, but 2025, we just talked about Madagascar. Here we go again. But all of this resurgence of coups on the continent in the last 5 years shouldn't blind us from the fact that Africa has a very long history of coups. 1956 to 2001, 80 successful coups, 108 failed coup attempts, and 139 coup plots in sub-Saharan Africa. That's the highest in the world ever. in terms of regions, and coups on the continent have impacted all types of government. So in many ways, understanding coups and military rule is at the very core of African studies itself. And because of that, there's a large literature on coups in Africa. But, as I'm trying to argue in the book, that very large literature tends to be gender blind. And because of it, we have what I would say is a rather impoverished understanding of coups. Our understanding of coups so far hasn't been that accurate, hasn't been that rigorous because of this neglect of the role of gender and women's politics. And the scholars who've primarily done this are scholars of politics. Historians, on the other hand, for example, or other feminist researchers, have emphasized the role of gender and women's politics, but particularly in the nature of coup-born military governments themselves. So you think of work by scholars such as Amina Mama, Yaliwe Clark, Nina Barr, Alicia Decker, Shemaine Pereira. These tend to be feminist researchers who are not scholars of politics, and thinking a lot about the gender defects of military government. But what I'm trying to do in the book is not just about military government, it's about coup motives themselves, coup dynamics, as well as the responses of international actors have these gendered processes at work. So I'll get into some of that here. So the structure of the talk, I'll start by saying a few things. I have only 30 minutes, so I'll move very rapidly. A few things about coup literature and gender at first. Then a few things about that coup resurgence and the role of gender in all of that. And then coming to the main case study of the book, which is Zimbabwe's 2017 coup and gender in that context. Right, so coup literature and gender, here we go. The first thing I think I should get across is that there's been a very influential piece written by Clayton Thine and Jonathan Powell from around about 2019, which tried to think about past, present, and future directions of coup research. And it also pinpoints understudied aspects of coups, as well as the ways in which prior studies could be improved. The ways that could be improved, it's refining cross-national data sets, better theoretically and empirically accounting for the link between coups and mass movements, expanding our knowledge of failed coups, trying to understand how and why mutinies evolved to become coups, why disgruntled soldiers would rather desert than stage a coup, increasing the number of works on coup outcomes, trying to understand the relationship between democracy and coups much better, and also understanding the role of international actors and factors in coup outcomes. So these are the 8 things that they say we need to better understand. Notice there, an influential piece, no gender at all, no emphasis on the role of women in that politics. The other thing to say beyond those reviews is the very nature of a lot of this coup literature in the first place. So think, for instance, in the context of Africa, Ruth First, The Barrel of a Gun, has been very influential. But what you find in that book is here and there sexist construals of coups. And the first here, for example, rightly identifies in the book that the striking feature of army interventions in politics is that almost every coup has a counter coup to follow. The coup spawns other coups. But then First goes astray by uncritically reproducing a sexist control of counter coups when she writes, "The virginity of the army is like that of a woman. Army men are fond of saying, once assailed, it is never attacked." The politics literature about coups is by and large devoid of such coarse sexist metaphors employed by the likes of First, but many political scientists uncritically utilize androcentric analytical frames or concepts when they write about coups. An example here would be Barbara Gett's work on strong men. This is when strong men, these are leaders who stage coups and then monopolize political power. Examples of strong men Historically, it would be Liberia's Samuel Doe, Gambia's Yahya Jammeh, and Nigeria's Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, all former coup makers. Also, you have in that literature, that politics literature about coups, the notion of African military rulers as big men. Examples would be Nigeria's Sani Abacha, Zaire's Mobutu Sese Seko. And in the neo-patrimonialism literature, which relies on concepts such as big men, these big men dominate politics because of their control of patronage levers. In addition to strong men and big men, you also have the term marginal men. So you think of John Bedell Bokassa was a coup maker in Central African Republic, Idi Amin in Uganda. This concept of marginal men has been used to conceptualize why a particular kind of African military leader attains political power in coups and to explain some of the specific outcomes of their leadership. Marginal men are men of low status, catapulted to power by greed, fear, avarice, or ambition, and they tend to view authority as stemming from the barrel of the gun. And they have exceedingly personalist control of authority and tend to be exceedingly cruel. So concepts such as big men, strong men, marginal men, used to understand coup-born military leaders are unambiguously androcentric and bereft of critical awareness of men as gendered beings. These male-centered politics concepts do not shed light on or explain the politics of women and gender in coup contexts. But what I want us to do here is to consider the work of Cynthia Lowe, feminist scholar herself, who writes that regarding the formulation of coups, feminists, militaries tend to be male-dominated. And because militaries are male-dominated, coup making is usually riddled with the workings of manliness. Typically, one or majority of the coup makers feminize those targeted in the coup in order to damage their credibility. That's what Lowe argues. Now, Lowe's observation is simple yet subtle. We might expect it to be amply demonstrated in political studies works about coups and in research about the ideas that shape the behaviors and declarations of coup plotters. But this is not the case. Politics studies generally underplay or take no notice of the gendered undercurrents of coup plotting and the gendered ways coup makers publicly perform or present themselves, even though their performances and pronouncements provide important indications about the gendered nature of coup dynamics and the likely effects of military government. Some examples of all this neglect of Lowe's observation. The political scientist Samuel De Callo, for example, contributed admirable work that helped shift attention away from the discipline's systematic weakness for focus on the systematic weaknesses of African states and the organizational features of African armies as reasons for coups in the African context. And De Callo basically asked us to think about the role of military hierarchies, officer cliques, corporate and personal ambitions. What I want to say here is that in drawing on Lowe's ideas, personal ambitions, officer cliques, and military hierarchies are themes ripe for the exploration of the workings of masculinities and femininities. Let me briefly take up the subject of the Central African Republic, the coup there in 1966. De Callo points out that Bokassa overthrew the president David Dacko in 1966 because their personal relations had become acrimonious, and the vain Bokassa was thoroughly disenchanted with what he regarded as indecisive and weak leadership on the part of Dacko. Now, what De Callo misses here is that constructions of strong versus weak leadership and decisive versus indecisive leadership are laden with particular ideas about femininity and masculinity in politics. To exercise decisive leadership is to be manly, and to be constructed as showing indecisiveness is to be feminized. Likewise, the notion of strong leadership is itself masculinized. In the case of the Central African Republic coup in 1966, strong leadership was supposed to be the hallmark of manly military men. In opposition, weakness is stereotypically constructed as a quality of femininity, and it was, in President Dako's case, the stamp of feeble or feminized civilian leaders without military background. In the 1960s and 1970s, soldiers who regularly conducted coups against civilian authority did so in the name of strong leadership, decisiveness. So you see this playing out throughout that period, but isn't picked up at all in much of the literature. Another example is Chukwuma Nzogu and Akwasi Afrifa, who were among the main architects of Nigeria's January 1966 coup and Ghana's February 1966 coup, respectively. In The Battle of the Gun, Ruth first writes that Nzogu and Afrifa were 2 course terms apart in their Sandhurst training in the UK. Ghanaian coup makers recount how they were spurred into action by taunts that the Nigerian soldiers who made the coup were men after all. What was wrong with Ghana's soldiers? This statement is a potentially revealing window into the workings of manliness and feminization in coup contagion. But, true to form, first does not develop it. The statement is made in passing in the book, quite early on in The Barrel of the Gun. Manliness and feminization in coup contagion are not even hinted at in the remainder of first lengthy study of coups in Ghana, Nigeria, and Sudan. Let's leave that old literature for now and think about the coup resurgence and the workings of gender in that context. And here, let me start with Burkina Faso's 2022 coup. On your screen, there are the standard reasons for the coup that have been put out in the literature, i.e. that it began as a mutiny, targeting officers who were corrupt, and then eventually morphed into targeting the leadership. It was about inadequate resources in the war against militants in northern Burkina Faso. Also, the argument that the president had been ineffective at uniting Burkina Faso at a time of crisis. So those are the standard explanations you'll find. But what's interesting about this, when we think of, if we apply or think about the workings of gender in this context, is that gendered ideas about protectors were at play in this coup. So Cynthia Law, going back to Cynthia Law's work, it reminds us that we need to keep a sharp feminist eye on ideas about protectors. Who are the most effective protectors? Who are thought of as the most effective protectors? These tend to be trained men who wield weapons. If so, then again, this interpretation is likely to make soldiers seem to be the most dependable protectors. So the removal by the military of President Kabore in Burkina Faso from power was clear indication it did not believe he was an effective protector of the welfare of combat soldiers and Burkina Faso broadly in the context of a security crisis. Conversely, Damiba, who staged the coup, was a proven wielder of arms and the author of a book about counterterrorism, and was imagined by revolting soldiers as best placed to protect the welfare of combat soldiers and Burkina Faso. So imagining combat soldiers as model protectors during a security crisis privileges militaristic masculinities over non-militaristic masculinities, reflected by elected civilian authorities such as Kabore, who I should point out was an ex-banker. Furthermore, given that combat soldiers are always male, women are cast as the protected, denying them agency or input in how insecurity can be practically improved. Another case from the recent coups is Chad's 2021 coup, which also showed signs of gendered ideas about protectors at work. Chad's President Idriss Deby was a French-trained Air Force pilot who first came to power as head of a rebel group that violently ousted President Habré in 1990. And he died suddenly in 2021, Idriss Deby. He died in action on the battlefield, in a battle between the National Army and the rebel group from northern Chad. Constitutionally, in the event of the president's demise, the head of Chad's National Assembly was supposed to have assumed a caretaker role and organized national elections. However, Chad's military illegally installed Idriss Deby's son, Mahamat Deby, who was the commander of the Presidential Guard, as a successor in what was described as a dynastic coup. Now, if we focus on the notion of dynastic coup, we miss something else that's very important here. When Kabadi, who was the head of the National Assembly, decided not to take on this caretaker role, he issued a public statement which read, "Considering that this mixed military security and political context in the country and the sub-region. I, the President of the National Assembly, in all clearness of mind, would like to put in place a transitional military council which would lead the political transition for peace and security. Now, France and other states backed this statement, which effectively allowed the military to take over power. But what was underlying in all this was the notion that to avert possible domestic instability and the loss of Chad as a steadfast actor in regional security operations, it was imagined that an effectual protector was required for the role of Chadian leader following the death of Idris Deby. The protector was inevitably a soldier, Mahamat Deby. On the other hand, Kabadi, who had a background in agronomy before he joined politics and became Speaker of the National Assembly, was plagued by poor health, making him weak. Here goes feminization again, hence unsuitable for the role of dependable protector. And because, as stated before, gendered ideas about protectors habitually typecast women as a protector, Chadian women were automatically excluded from the country's presidential succession politics following Deby's sudden death in 2021. In this construction, only manly men who reflect a militaristic masculinity, not women who personify femininity or womanliness, could succeed the slain protector Deby, himself a model of militaristic masculinity, even in the evening of life, as evidenced by his death on the battlefield. So that's, you see feminization, workings of masculinities in these recent coups as well. But the standard explanations in the literature don't put their finger on these. Let's turn now to our case, which is the main case for the book, Zimbabwe's 2017 coup. And here I'll just highlight a few points. There's a lot to get through, but I'll just pick up on a few things. For example, some politics scholars writing about this coup have likened Grace Mugabe, who was the wife of Robert Mugabe at the time, as a glazed Marie Antoinette, who, following the 2017 coup, grinned vacantly and was bemused at missing the guillotine. There was a general fixation with Grace Mugabe that went beyond Zimbabwean borders. The characterization of Grace Mugabe in these terms as some kind of Marie Antoinette demonstrates the influence of popular sexist tropes even in the academy. The study of politics mirrors the wider culture, even as it works to explain it. We must always remember. Also, beyond the academy, media in and outside Zimbabwe incessantly likened Grace Mugabe to Marie Antoinette. Zimbabwean opposition parties also employed the Marie Antoinette trope to describe Grace Mugabe. In addition, trade books about Zimbabwean politics often use the Marie Antoinette trope in their discussion of Grace Mugabe's politics. For example, we read from Heidi Holland's book that Grace Mugabe marched into Mugabe's life like a princess who thought she was entitled to whatever she wished. Others refer to Grace Mugabe as a first shopper, Gucci Grace, that Grace Mugabe was empty-headed and vain, and she had her nails painted and repainted almost hourly. That Grace Mugabe had incredible financial appetites. All of these Marie Antoinette tropes were proliferated by trade books. Now, of course, the real Marie Antoinette was an Austrian princess, partner of the 18th century king of France, King Louis XVI. She was publicly beheaded in 1793 in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And in the build-up of the French Revolution, the monarchy became incredibly unpopular owing to political excess, deepening socio-economic morass, and its application of inequitable taxes. Now, Louis XVI's unpopularity was exacerbated by popular French constructions of Marie Antoinette as a corrupt and gluttonous foreign whore. However, because of patriarchal forgetting, we forget crucial facts about Marie Antoinette's life. After being informed of a severe shortage of bread confronting French people, Marie Antoinette is commonly believed to have callously responded, "Let them eat cake," which was costlier. "Let them eat cake" became a rallying phrase for the death of the monarchy, and Marie Antoinette in particular during the French Revolution, because it pointed out her cold-heartedness and that she was out of touch with the daily suffering of ordinary French people. Now, it's a myth. In truth, biographers have debunked this, that Marie Antoinette ever uttered that deadly phrase, "Let them eat cake." In fact, the lethal phrase, "let them eat cake," had been known for at least a century previously when it was ascribed to the Spanish princess Maria Therese, the bride of French King Louis XIV. So Marie Antoinette was sentenced to death following a meticulously stage-managed gender-biased trial. For example, one of the unproven charges against Marie Antoinette that was controversially found guilty of was sexual intercourse with her son Louis Charles, a child who eventually died aged 10. It was said that the real object of this criminal intercourse was that she wanted to ensure that when he became king, she would be able to dominate him when he was on the throne. Also, it's also often forgotten that when Marie Antoinette applied for adjournment of her trial, so that her lawyer could have time to carefully review the evidence brought against her, the application was obstructed because without an adjournment, Marie Antoinette would stand trial during her menstrual period, when she would be at her weakest, based perhaps on information supplied by her doctor. Significantly, during the trial, the medicine and nourishing soup that she often used at these particular times was stopped in order to weaken, so to speak. So what I'm trying to say here is Marie Antoinette's life story is complicated and set in a politically tempestuous time. But patriarchal forgetting deprives Marie Antoinette of complexity, only permitting a crude yarn about a power-hungry woman of loose morals, corruption, insensitivity. This crude yarn is expedient. It enables effortless construction of diverse first ladies by African coup makers as Marie Antoinette-type figures that marry into political power, gradually gain undue political influence, and corruptly acquire colossal wealth. Grace Mugabe was one such figure constructed in that way. There's another example. Niger's 1974 coup is the first lady called Issa Diori. She was constructed in similar ways. So what I want to say, this is during the coup, there was a big march one of the days during the coup where citizens came out to support it. And these placards that ordinary citizens who came out to support the coup were holding up were generated by the coup makers. And a lot of the leadership is not sexually transmitted is the one I've chosen to highlight here. And they did this because coup makers use Grace Mugabe as a convenient cover for the coup's real motivations. So the generals who led the coup, their core reasons for the coup had nothing to do with fear that Mugabe planned to install Grace Mugabe as a successor, or that she had become a Marie Antoinette-type figure with increasing political influence and deeply corrupt. The generals' main reasons for the coup, like the fact that Mugabe planned to retire some of the generals, hence they feared losing their jobs and attended privileges, would have been difficult to sell as justifications for the coup to the military's rank and file, Zimbabwean society, diplomats, media, regional and international actors. Contrary-wise, a gendered tale about an unruly woman, Grace Mugabe, who had usurped an old and helpless president's authority, Robert Mugabe, or the fabrication that Grace Mugabe was some kind of Marie Antoinette, increasingly unpopular and the most corrupt individual in politics, were a more compelling fig leaf for the coup. That Grace Mugabe transgressed the margins of what was considered respectable femininity by, for example, publicly slating grown men in their presence and projecting bellicosity, made her an opportune target for sexist and misogynistic vitriol that distracted from the coup makers' self-interested reasons for rolling out the coup. The gendered depictions of Grace Mugabe, which she no doubt actively gave legs through her own independent actions, appealed to many Zimbabweans and non-Zimbabweans' patriarchal beliefs. Therefore, in the coup, a lone woman became the scapegoat for Mugabe overstaying in power, state corruption, national socio-economic problems, and general misrule by the ruling party. So these are some of the gendered themes I tried to pull out in the book. It's been swift, rapid. I only had 30 minutes, but I'll stop here so we can have some questions about this, and hopefully also talk a bit about the coup in Madagascar. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much for that very, very interesting presentation of the themes that are brought up in your book. So now, as the chat notes, please enter your questions into the Q&A part of Zoom, and we will go ahead and share them with our speaker. We do have an initial one that was posted in chat, and I'll go ahead and read that. There is a saying that a coup begat another coup. Currently, something that looks like a coup is unfolding in Zimbabwe. Based on your understanding, do the current leaders of the Gaza revolution decisive, and what is the probability of its success?
Wow, that's a tricky one. So, just for those who may not know, so the coup in 2017 occurred. The generals who led the coup decided not to formally take power themselves, but to install a civilian leader called Emerson Mnangagwa. So Mnangagwa has been the president since 2017 to the present. However, which this is not unusual for post coup situations. When coups occur, you either have a junta, which would mean Mnangagwa would have continued to govern as equals with the generals. He staged the coup. They'd be working as a junta. Or in other instances, one of the individuals who was involved in the coup works to systematically sideline, whether by elimination or simply outwitting, other players who assisted or worked with that person in the coup. And this is where Barbara Getz and other scholars would call that particular type of leader who emerges in that situation a strong man. I don't subscribe to that, as I referred to before. But let's, for argument's sake, let's just deploy the term here. Mnangagwa has emerged as a strong man since 2017. Many of the generals who were involved in the coup in 2017 have died, some in suspicious ways, been retired, sent off in places as diplomats, and there's only one remaining key general from that coup in 2017, an individual called Constantino Chiwenga, who is the current vice president. And there's open, very clear friction between the two. Presently, the ruling party is at an important end-of-year conference, and a lot has been said by Chiwenga himself and other figures who back Mnangagwa, critical exchanges. So this is what generated talk about the possibility of a follow-on coup from 2017. But I'll say two things about the likelihood of that. I think while Chiwenga is vice president and is important in the political sense, he is no longer the most important soldier in Zimbabwe today. The most important soldier in Zimbabwe today is the current overall commander of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, an individual called Philip Sibanda. Philip Sibanda was also involved in the 2017 coup. So what I will say to answer your question is to say coups that succeed the most are coups staged by generals because they have command, they control intelligence. If a coup is to occur in Zimbabwe and be successful, it would have to have Philip Sibanda's backing or planning. What is the relationship between Mnangagwa and Philip Sibanda? I think that's a key thing to understand. Presently, I think they're still working well together. Relations between them have not broken down irreparably. So I don't see the possibility of a coup by the generals at this stage. However, since the coup in 2017, conditions in the military for the rank and file, so conditions in the barracks, conditions of service, have not improved markedly. So you have many disaffected junior soldiers. That's the other possibility of the coup, by the junior soldiers taking matters into their own hands, particularly in the context of rising corruption and continued economic decline. The challenge with that, however, becomes coups by junior soldiers are the ones that are least likely to succeed because they don't control intelligence, they have no command of other soldiers. So unlikely to succeed, unlike a coup from above. And secondly, coups by junior soldiers because they don't have command over other men and knowledge of or control of military intelligence. Junior soldiers, more often than not, have to shoot their way to power. So likely to be a very violent coup. So I would say those are the two scenarios. A lot has to do about the relationship between the current president Mnangagwa and the most important soldier in Zimbabwe today, Philip Sibanda, and also the degree to which junior soldiers might take matters into their own hands. The challenge with the understanding the dynamic of the junior soldiers is the military in Zimbabwe is about 40,000 strong. So you're talking about trying to think about what 40 soldiers, let's just say 39,000, we might consider lower ranking soldiers, are thinking and planning. It's very hard to understand that. And remember, to do a coup, you probably need about 200 to 300 soldiers in this context. So hard to say. But there is that possibility that those younger soldiers might take matters in their own hands. So I think it's in the air. It is possible. The president has been said since the 2017 coup. But there are various pros and cons, various risks about whether a coup would actually take place. And we have to think carefully whether it's a coup from above, generals, or a coup from below, junior soldiers. And both these have different degrees of likelihood of success. I hope that answers you.
Okay, the next question would like to ask about the argument that coups are androcentric in Africa because men usually have a high-risk appetite for power more than women. Hence, they take an initiative that would risk everything for power. Is this a fair observation?
No, I don't think it's a fair observation. In that it's almost essentializing men per se. I think the issue here, what we need to understand, is the workings of patriarchy, the system, relationships of power, beliefs, ideas that privilege particular masculinities over other masculinities, but over all femininity. So I think it's patriarchy, you want to get it, not men per se. But the other thing I would also say about that is while militaries are male dominated, in a sense, you do have female soldiers. But because of these blind spots, the androcentric focus, the views, the actions, the roles female soldiers might have played in coups has never actually been considered. And one remarkable case, I think it was the case of the coup in Guinea. I think it's in 2022, led by Mamadi Doumbouya. When the coup is made, the spokesperson of the junta that seizes power is a female soldier, a lady called Diallo. Nobody has bothered to. What role did she actually play? What were other female soldiers' views on the coup? What input might they have had? Right, including thinking about the Zimbabwean coup in 2017, when Chiwenga makes the first public threat to Robert Mugabe, first signal that there's likely to be a coup. This is on 13 November 2017. In the room he makes this threat, it's a press conference. He's brought together all the most influential soldiers in the military. There were female soldiers in that room as well, but no one has bothered to find them. So I would want to make this about men. It's a lot about patriarchy, but there's also been this blind spot. We've not thought a lot about the role of female soldiers. I should also say that when we think about coups and their causes, it would also be useful to move away from just what happens in the military barracks. So in the military barracks, that's where you'd find the female soldiers. The male soldiers who lead the coups also have partners. They have wives. They may have, if they're not married, lovers. That private space is also political. Thoughts, political views are shared in that private space. What input in that private space do wives and lovers also have on coup making? So that's another way you would want to. And so to make it about men, I think would be kind of missing the point. Okay, hope that addresses your question.
Okay, the next is about lack of gender and other diversity perspectives in foreign policy. In recent years, a few countries have announced feminist foreign policy frameworks. What is your assessment of these initiatives, and what do you think is still missing in making foreign policy more inclusive and representative, and ultimately our analyses more accurate and holistic?
That's a great question because the context or the study that the book mainly focuses on, Zimbabwe, had and still has a Swedish embassy. And Sweden at the time stood for a feminist foreign policy. And the book is partly about the responses of diplomats and how that interacted with local politics. So I spent a lot of time talking to various ambassadors or diplomats, including the Swedes. And it was remarkable that despite officially Sweden having this feminist foreign policy, I won't mention names, but some of the most, shall we say, Marie Antoinette type views about Grace Mugabe came from Swedish diplomats. To me, that was astounding. And I would push back to say, but you have this feminist foreign policy. How is it that Sweden did not come out to condemn a coup that was overtly gendered in these various ways, right? It soon became clear that other interests trumped the feminist outlook. So it will always be, for instance, that there was a feeling, Sweden being part of the EU, that isolation of Robert Mugabe, applications of sanctions, isolation of Zimbabwe, the policy simply had not worked. They needed to try something new. You had other players in the EU saying China and others were gaining increasing entry in Zimbabwe and accessing lithium, alluvial diamonds, and other minerals. Zimbabwe is very mineral rich. And because of this fractious relationship, the EU and the West more broadly had not been able to capitalize on this, on exploiting these resources. So that ought to be the reason why the coup shouldn't be condemned. So there are various reasons that came into play. But geopolitics, self-interest, and also I think the very fact that Mugabe himself was a much loathed figure internationally made any considerations about a feminist foreign policy, adopting that, fade into the background, because its adoption would likely have resulted in the West, say, doing the right thing by, yes, Mugabe is an undemocratic leader, but this is a coup. In terms of principle, we must condemn it and seek to reverse it, right? Two wrongs don't make a right. But because those other interests outweighed, the feminist foreign policy framework faded into the background. So I think it's been much played up by some states, adopted as official policy, but the practice has meant quite the opposite. And then I would say, broadly, just coming back to us thinking about the present, I think if it was hard enough for feminist foreign policy to have traction back in 2017, 2020, 2025 is an even harder time. And we see this all around us. There is backlash against things such as gender, international, right? So it's even harder now to do. So in a sense, almost I think the moment was missed, and we probably kind of have to wait for that moment to come around again. And when it does, hopefully this time it will go beyond formal statements, rhetorical, or adoption as policy, but never the practical implementation of what I think would have been, particularly in the case of this book, a useful way of thinking about or approaching the coup. And as the book argues, if coups are gendered in the various ways we've talked about here, then any kind of international response needs to take seriously gender as well, right? Those considerations, but it's absent. So yeah, hope that addresses your question somewhat.
Our next question is multi-part. I'm going to read you the first part, and if time allows, we'll circle back, but I know that we have other questions on the board. So this first part of the question is, your framing of gender as central to coup dynamics was exceptionally thought-provoking. They would be grateful for your thoughts on a few follow-up questions. How do you conceptually integrate gender and women's politics into coup studies without reducing them to an additive variable rather than a constitutive dimension of power?
Mm-hmm. Look, I think what you'd want to do in that context, I think the best way to study coups, and this has always been one of the challenges of the coups, or studying coups, you would never, particularly if you take, for example, coup motives, find a general theory that explains the causes of coups effectively. The theory kind of works in one context, but then probably runs aground in another. So it's always good to think about coups as having an eclectic set of causes that are very different from case to case. So country by country, and even within a country, if you have a coup this year, another coup in 2 years' time, in the same country has different causes. So what I want to, in saying, why am I bringing this up, is to say not to try to strongly make the case for it being a variable or integrating it outright, but to really take them case by case and see what it is. That's why I think that's the best way to. Coups are historically situated. They're very contextual, and I wouldn't want to almost prescribe a single conceptual way of integrating gender and women's policy. Is to you look at it as it is, take it in that sense. So, for instance, just thinking about. I know I said I wanted to bring up, wanted to talk a little about Madagascar, and I will here because there've been no questions about it. One of the interesting things about, say, Madagascar, and want to say, contrasted with Zimbabwe. In the Zimbabwean case, it wasn't just gender, women's politics wasn't just a variable. It was absolutely central, integral to the causes itself. In the Madagascar case, a recent one, you can't make the same case. Why I say this is because the Madagascar coup is unlike, this is what I mean about treating coups context by context, unlike the Zimbabwean coup in 2017. The 2017 coup in Zimbabwe was a traditional coup. In a traditional coup, the relationship between civilian authority and the military fractures, and the military oust the civilian authority. The Madagascar coup that's just happened isn't a traditional coup. In the sense that relations between the president, Rajoelina, and the key units in the military was actually very close up until 2 to 3 weeks ago, when there were sustained protests by civilians, and civilians were protesting over lack of water and power cuts as well. It's in that context that the military actors calculated that civilian protests were not fading away. They continued to come to the fore. And in those contexts, what's been referred to by scholars such as Kohler as endgame coups come into play. So endgame coups are not traditional coups. This is where the civilian authority and the military are actually tied together. But the military decides to sacrifice the civilian authority in order to assuage protesters. That's what happened. So in the Madagascar case, if you want to think of what role gender and women's politics would have played, you won't find it in, say, the relationship between Rajoelina and the military, which was the case between Mugabe, his wife, and the military. The role of gender and women's politics comes in the protests themselves. If you look at the protests, some of the key players in the protest movements were actually women. It was women's politics at play. So if you think here, for instance, the core grievance was lack of water and power. Who does water, in a patriarchal context, water, power most affect? It's women in the households who have to perform various chores or tasks in the domestic space. So they were very aggravated by all this. It brought them out, right? So that creates the context in which this endgame coup becomes possible. So it's a variable in a sense. But the actual motivations, in the end, why the military decides to ditch Rajoelina in the face of this protest, it is about calculations, relations that went on behind closed doors between Rajoelina and the soldiers. That we don't yet know about because nobody has researched it. But certainly the background or the setting for this, what we'll call an endgame coup, had women at its core, but not the actual cause of the coup. I hope that kind of addresses you. So I'm trying to say, in a sense, take it case by case, contextual, the histories, they matter. They're very different in that way. Sorry for sneaking in Madagascar. I'm just dying to talk about it.
We have two related questions. The first is, since coups are substantively a result of political competition for power and access to economic resources, in your research, how does gender, or specifically influence the outbreak of trajectories of coups? Was there evidence from Zimbabwe or elsewhere that female partners or colleagues of coup plotters and leaders influenced the coup? Also, the other question that I thought was related is, do you think that women or wives to these politicians are aware of what's about to happen, or are they informed in the 11th hour? He notes that the questioner asks, they suspect that they were usually marginalized when it comes to plotting the coup. What are your thoughts?
Right. Let me start with the last one. Mm-hmm. In the book, I write about how when the key general in the 2017 coup, Chiwenga, is planning the coup, he would stage what he called cabinet meetings at his residence, private residence, where he would have the key coup planners over. And they were thinking about the coup, and also discussing general national politics. The key hostess at these events was Chiwenga's wife, Mary. She would come in, sit with them. When it was meal time, she's the one who would basically arrange to organize these gatherings. So she was in the know. She absolutely knew. And when the coup eventually unfolds, she's very close to the scene throughout. So there is knowledge, and one would want to know when those, particularly when those opportunities to in those private spaces to discuss the possibility of coup and what it might look like, what input she might or might not have had. I think it really matters. And it's not just I also want to say, it's not just from a mental point of view. Sometimes just sheer solidarity, emotional support, doesn't matter if it's coming from male or female partner, right, is significant in these processes, because coups, regardless the tactical planning and the sort, also require a certain emotional steel, courage. Where do you get that input? Most likely from your partner, whether your partner is male or female. So I think there was active knowledge. Knowledge was there. They were not marginal. They were very much aware. And I read about this, Mary being the host of these. She was the one who played hostess during these gatherings. So she was very much in the know. The degree of her input, though, we don't know about yet. Then I think the other question was about gender. I think you wouldn't want to reduce them to just power. I think power is important. You seize power. Those who stage coups are interested in power, so it is important. But it's also more than that. That's why I said they're an eclectic set of reasons. So thinking, for example, of the Nigeria coup in 1966. In 1966 Nigeria, there's a coup in January that brings a General Agui Ironsi to power. Ironsi is from the Igbo ethnic group. And non-Igbos, particularly northern soldiers, who got killed and lost many officers in that January 1966 coup, decide to stage a counter coup 6 months later in July 1966 coup. And this coup was called the Revenge Coup. And in that Revenge Coup, it was imbued with the workings of masculinities. So our northern soldiers were butchered in the January coup. The 66 coup, we're going to reassert our manliness, our dominance as northern soldiers in the Nigerian military by wiping out the Igbos and staging this coup. So 6 months later, July 1966, they staged this coup, the revenge coup. Iranzi and other key Igbos are killed in that coup. But lo and behold, guess what happens after that 66 coup? Because it's just a revenge coup, there is actually no plan. Like so we've done it. We've taken out the leadership. You have to govern right now. This is what I mean about it. So sometimes it's not just about power. It's these genders at play. There was no plan for a takeover, so they had no idea for what the government would look like, what they would do. So once the coup has been, those who are in charge have been eliminated, Iranzi and others, there is what's been referred to as the 3-day debate. So soldiers sat around any cage or barracks, and all kinds of people, diplomats, international actors, local sort came in trying to give their input about, okay, so we've staged it, but what do we do? Who's going to govern? Who's going to take over? And lo and behold, it was not any of the individuals who staged the coup that became president. The eventual president was Yakubu Gowon. He becomes the president after that coup. Gowon had nothing to do with the coup at all. He was actually only sent to the barracks by one of the key generals to negotiate with the coup soldiers. And eventually, in those interactions, they begin to say, this Gowon guy makes a lot of sense. He's clever. He's calm. He seems to exude leadership qualities. Maybe we should make him the president. So not even the coup makers themselves, it's Gowon eventually. And so it was about this workings of manliness, obviously entwined with ethnic differences. So I wouldn't want to say always just about power, to reduce it to that. Sometimes these militaristic masculinities, which are very important in this context, really drive coup making, and not so much power for its own sake. And I think that July 66 coup in Nigeria is a good example of that. Hope that answers you. Madagascar, anyone?
I think we'll offer you a couple of minutes at the very end to perhaps give your thoughts on what's going on in Madagascar, and then Dr. Joel Cabrita can give you some a farewell and a thank you. So, Dr. Tendi, what would you like to say about what's going on?
Very kind, Robin. No, I think what I'd want to say, the most striking thing, I think it's not a traditional coup, it's an endgame coup, as I talked about before. But the most remarkable thing is, within Madagascar, is situated in southern Africa. In southern Africa, the last coup was the Zimbabwe one in 2017. And the regional body is the Southern African Development Community, SADC. In the book, I read a lot about the missteps by SADC in that coup. And it is remarkable that years later, we've seen similar missteps with regard to this Madagascar coup. So almost no learning, despite the passing of so many years and the warning of what has happened since 2020 in Western Central Africa, that coups were back. Yeah, it's a crisis that's going to keep coming up, and you need to be prepared. So no sense of that there was any early warning systems in place. And also remarkable that the president of Madagascar, Rajwa, who's been removed from power, also happens to be the chairperson of the SADC body I'm just referring to. So even from an institutional pride point of view, where other leaders go, but this is the chairperson of SADC has been moving through for the pride of SADC, we must react. You have not seen that at all. Also, when you want to think about the case of the Zimbabwean coup in 2017, Robert Mugabe had a very hard time trying to mobilize other SADC leaders to support it, to reverse the coup. But this is actually the SADC chairperson who can actually call up and say, I'm under siege, there's a coup. There's been no movement. And most remarkable, last thing I'll say about this is when the soldiers formally announced that they've taken over, this was yesterday. At about that time, during those similar hours, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of the most powerful state in Southern Africa, South Africa, was on X posting videos of himself doing fist bumps, the sort, elated because South Africa had just beaten Rwanda 3-0 and qualified for the 2026 Football World Cup. Meanwhile, the coup makers were formally announcing their coup in Madagascar. So you even this is the most powerful state into the priorities. I checked up until about 2 p.m. UK time. Ramaphosa still had not pronounced what has happened in Madagascar, but football seemed to matter more. So I think for me also, I think it is the absence of really SADC coming together to uphold anti-coup norms in the region. We saw that in 2017, the Zimbabwean case, which is the subject of the book. And it's remarkable that in 2025, the situation is pretty much similar. And I think the signal that then sends to other militaries in the region, you can pull off the coup because you're unlikely to face any kind of regional robust response. I think that's where I would leave. I could say more about Madagascar, but I think let me leave it there. Yeah.
Professor Tendi, thank you so much. And this is such a sobering note to leave us on about the limits and the failures of regional frameworks and institutions like SADC in, as you say, preventing cultures of coup from becoming endemic in Southern Africa. I'm sure that I speak for the 50 or so people who've joined us over the course of the last hour when I say this has been truly fascinating, such a pleasure to hear an interdisciplinary political science, gender studies perspective on an area of study that tends to be typed and portrayed male in ways that I think have become so normalized that we don't even question it. So your analysis has been incredibly thought-provoking and personally I found it incredibly interesting and provocative. So thank you so much for that. I encourage everyone to get your book, to read it, and to gender coups going forward. I think this is really, really great advice. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who came by and the challenging questions, not always easy to address. Thank you for the great questions. Yeah.
And apologies to all of those in the audience whom we didn't have time to get to your great questions. And I'm sure Professor Tendi will be glad to speak with you if you email him directly. Thank you again, and thanks to the great team at Centre for African Studies for organising today and making it possible. And thank you to Professor Tendi and, of course, to the audience. Bye.